Welcome to the Midnight Library, a place where the night feels calm, the world slows down, and stories become a gentle pathway to rest. Find a quiet spot, settle in, and let your body sink into stillness. Breathe deeply in and out, leaving the day behind. This is your time to rest, your time to dream, your time to drift. And now, let us begin tonight's story.
The porch was older than the house itself, or so people like to say. Its beams were worn smooth from years of touch. Hands that had built, rested, worried, loved, and let go. It faced west, where the evening sun fell slow and heavy over the ridge, spilling gold across the wooden steps. That light, caught in the grain of the boards, had a way of softening everything it touched. For the carpenter, it was the best place in the world. He lived alone now, though he hadn't always. The house was quiet except for the creaks that came with weather and time, and the occasional groan of the porch when he stepped out with his cup of coffee. Every morning began the same. The soft hiss of the kettle, the faint smell of pine shavings that never seemed to leave his clothes, and the sound of the wind brushing through the long grass behind the shed. The carpenter had been many things in his life. A father, a husband, a maker of boats, a builder of tables, but lately he was just a watcher of days. The porch was where he worked when the weather was kind. Its boards were uneven, and the railing leaned slightly toward the field, but it was steady enough for the small projects that kept his hands busy. Today, he was shaping a chair leg from maple, working slowly with the rhythm of the wind. Each curl of wood that fell from his knife landed like a petal. He didn't rush. He hadn't rushed in years. He could still remember when the porch had been crowded, when laughter spilled from the kitchen window, and his daughter used to sit on the steps painting her shoes different colors. The memory of her giggle drifted through the years like the scent of lilacs after rain. Always there, faint but present. She had grown up and moved to a city far away, where she built her own life among glass buildings and neon skies. She called sometimes, and her voice always carried warmth, but there was a softness to her words that told him she missed things she didn't have time to name. In the afternoons, the carpenter liked to sit with his back against the porch post, facing the old oak tree that marked the edge of his land. The tree had grown wide and strong over the years, a keeper of secrets. Beneath it, he had buried the dog who once followed him everywhere. The mound was nearly flat now, the grass thick and green, and sometimes he imagined he could still hear the faint jingle of the dog's collar in the wind. As evening settled, he set aside his tools. The lake down the hill began to glow silver, catching the last of the day. Frogs had started their song, soft and low, a kind of music that reminded him the world went on no matter how quietly one lived. He leaned back and let the air fill him, cool and sweet with the scent of cut wood and water. A car occasionally passed on the distant road, its hum rising and falling like a wave. The world beyond his porch seemed faster now, always moving, always wanting something new. But here time didn't push, it drifted. The carpenter liked that. He liked that his porch didn't ask for much. Only a little care now and then, a nail tightened, a board replaced. When the stars began to appear, he went inside and lit the small lamp near the window. The light spilled out onto the porch, catching dust motes in a golden dance. He poured himself a drink and sat again, watching the shadows move across the fields. Somewhere an owl called. The sound echoed softly, and he smiled because it felt like an old friend saying good night. He thought of the people he'd built things for, the families who had sat at his tables, the children who had slept in the beds he'd crafted, the old couples who had rocked on the chairs he'd carved. He liked to imagine that, somewhere in those homes, the pieces of wood still held a little of the care he had put into them. Wood had memory, he believed. Not in the way people thought of memory, but in the way it aged, how it kept the shape of every touch. Maybe in its own quiet way it remembered everything. The night grew deeper, and the hum of crickets wrapped the porch in a steady lull. His eyes grew heavy, and for a moment he thought of his wife, the way she used to hum as she hung the laundry, her hair pinned loosely, her feet bare on the steps. It had been years since she'd gone, but her presence was still here, woven into the board she used to sweep, in the chair she once sat in to watch the sunset. He sometimes talked to her softly, not expecting an answer, but feeling that the space between the words was enough. The carpenter drifted in and out of thought, his hand resting on the smooth rail. The moon rose above the ridge, pale and whole, and he watched it cast long shadows across the yard. Somewhere in the trees, fireflies began to blink. tiny lamps in the dark. He took another slow sip, his body at ease, his heart light. The world seemed balanced in that moment. Nothing to fix, nothing to plan, only the slow rhythm of breathing, of being. He closed his eyes and listened. The porch creaking with the wind, the soft whistle of the lake, the distant rustle of leaves. It was the same symphony every night, one that had no beginning or end. He thought, perhaps, that this was what peace sounded like. Not silence, but the steady hum of life continuing gently all around you. When sleep finally came, it came softly, as it always did. The carpenter didn't dream of much anymore, only of sunlight across old wood, the warmth of familiar hands, and the endless calm of his porch watching over him, holding the night steady until morning. The next morning began the way so many of them did, softly, without sound. The carpenter stirred to the faint brightness that crept through the lace curtains, that silvery early light that made the dust motes look like floating embers. His eyes opened slowly, without hurry, and he lay for a moment listening. The house had its usual language, the sigh of the old floorboards, the faint settling of wood as the cool night surrendered to warmth. Beyond the window, birds had already begun their gentle chatter, the small, contented notes of morning life. He rose carefully, his knees stiff but patient. His hand brushed the edge of the bedpost he had carved himself decades ago. The wood had worn smooth where his hand always touched it, the grain darkened by time and use. He found comfort in that, in the way something could last so long and still hold kindness. He walked barefoot to the kitchen, where the smell of coffee soon joined the sound of birds. He filled a chipped mug, leaned against the counter, and let the warmth settle into his hands. Outside, the porch waited, glowing faintly in the soft amber of dawn. Mist hung over the field like a shawl, wrapping the edges of the world in hush. He stepped outside and breathed deeply. The air was cool enough to wake him but gentle enough to keep him still. The chair he had repaired last week sat ready, its wood glistening faintly from the morning dew. He sat down, the wood creaking familiarly beneath him. From here, he could see the barn at the edge of the property. Its red paint faded to rust and rose. The fields beyond stretched toward the tree line where sunlight broke through in ribbons. He had built the barn too long ago, back when his hands were steadier, when the days were longer because he shared them. His wife had once kept her garden there, rows of flowers that drew bees and laughter in equal measure. He could almost smell them again if he tried, the mix of soil, mint, and marigold. He took another sip of coffee and watched the sun climb. It touched everything with color, the grass, the fence, the boards of the porch that he'd patched and polished so many times. Each board held its own story. He remembered how he and his daughter had painted the railing white one summer afternoon, her small hand gripping the brush too tightly, streaks of paint running unevenly down the spindles. She'd been so proud when it was done, even though her little handprints had remained at the base of the post for years afterward. He'd never washed them off. As the morning deepened, he turned to the small table beside his chair. On it sat a block of walnut, half-shaped into something new. He picked up his chisel, turned the wood in his hand, and began to work. His movements were deliberate, slow, the kind of rhythm that came from knowing what the grain wanted. The sound of the blade against the wood was steady and satisfying, a conversation, not a command. Hours slipped away easily. The sun moved higher, casting lines of shadow through the porch posts. Every now and then, he paused to stretch or to look across the field. A hawk drifted overhead, circling lazily. The carpenter admired its ease, the way it seemed to trust the air completely. That trust, that unspoken faith in what holds you up, was something he understood deeply. By afternoon, the sky had turned clear and bright, and the warmth settled into his bones. He wiped his brow with the back of his hand, set the wood aside, and leaned back. The hum of insects filled the air. Bees moved among the flowers at the edge of the porch, their wings catching the light like glass. Somewhere down the road, a neighbor's truck rumbled past. It was distant, fading quickly. Life had moved on around him, but that didn't make him sad. There was a peace in being part of the background, in living quietly without rush or noise. He looked at his hands, the small scars, the calluses that refused to fade. Each mark told a story, though not one anyone else would ever know. He thought of how his father's hands had looked when he was young, rough and sure, always building, fixing, steadying. Those hands had taught him everything, though his father had been a man of few words. The lessons had come through the rhythm of work, through the way he held a hammer, or sanded an edge, or leaned back to admire something finished. The carpenter smiled faintly. He wondered if his daughter would ever think of him that way, if she'd remember the sound of his tools, the scent of sawdust and rain. As the day faded, clouds began to gather near the horizon, soft and gray. A light wind stirred, carrying the scent of earth and water. He could tell there would be rain by nightfall. He loved the rain. The sound of it on the porch roof was like a song that never grew old. It made everything feel closer. The world, the memories, the quiet hum of thought. He set his tools aside and began to tidy up, brushing away curls of wood and dust. He stacked his finished pieces neatly near the wall, small boxes, picture frames, and one wooden bowl that gleamed like polished amber. He planned to send it to his daughter when it was ready. He imagined her opening the parcel, running her fingers along the smooth curve, maybe setting it on her kitchen table where city light would fall across it. That thought alone warmed him more than the fire ever could. The first drops began to fall just as he stepped back outside. They tapped lightly against the roof, a soft percussion that filled the air with rhythm. The smell of rain drifted in, clean, full, alive. He sat again in his chair, his drink warm in his hand, and watched the rain streak down across the field. The porch boards darkened, shining like river stones. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the sound wash through him. The rain grew steadier, the sky deepened into blue-gray, and the world blurred behind the curtain of water. It was the kind of rain that erased edges, that made everything blend, the trees, the lake, the sky, all one soft moving surface. He could hear the low rumble of thunder, far away, and smiled faintly. The dog would have barked at that once. His wife would have laughed. He could almost hear her voice, gentle and teasing. "You always love a storm more than sunshine." He did, because storms, he thought, were honest. They reminded him that stillness was something you returned to, not something you could hold forever. He let the thought fade. The rain became his company, the porch his small world, and for a long time he simply listened. When the storm passed, the world smelled new. The air shimmered with the freshness of earth, and drops clung to every leaf and blade of grass. The carpenter stayed outside until twilight settled, until the sky blushed faintly with what little light was left. Fireflies appeared one by one, flickering softly in the damp air. Their glow reflected faintly off the wet boards, and he watched them dance as if they were tiny bits of memory come to visit. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and breathed deeply. The scent of the wet wood reminded him of the first day he built this porch, the sound of the hammer, the laughter that had followed every mistake, the way his wife had stood barefoot on the steps, smiling as she watched him work. Every board, every nail, every groove was part of that day, and now, years later, it still held her. The porch had become more than just part of the house. It was a vessel for everything that mattered: love, work, quiet, and time. He stayed there long after darkness had settled completely. The stars shimmered faintly through the thinning clouds, and a breeze carried the faint rustle of the trees. His thoughts slowed until they were almost dreams. He didn't fight sleep when it came. He let it fold over him, easy and deep, the sound of the rain still echoing somewhere far away. The carpenter and the porch were one in that moment. Two things built by time, softened by care, still standing, still listening to the rhythm of the world. The night carried on, patient and tender, and the man slept while the porch kept watch, holding the quiet steady until morning found them again. The next morning came slowly, wrapped in mist and pale gold. The carpenter woke to the smell of rain lingering in the air, that soft scent of damp earth and pine that always followed a night storm. His eyes opened to the gentle light that slipped through the curtains like a whisper, illuminating the dust floating in the room. He stayed in bed for a moment longer, listening to the quiet hum of the house. Every creak and sigh of the old wood felt familiar, like an old friend breathing beside him. He sat up, his back stiff but steady, and swung his legs over the side of the bed. The floorboards were cool beneath his feet. He stood slowly, stretching until the stiffness in his shoulders eased. His house was small, but everything in it carried a story. The chair near the window that his wife used to read in, the kitchen shelf he'd built for her tea jars, the small framed photograph of their daughter standing barefoot in the garden, a flower crown on her head, and a smile that still made his heart ache gently when he saw it. He brewed his morning coffee, the aroma filling the space as steam curled upward. The same mug as always, chipped at the rim, worn smooth where his thumb rested. He stepped out onto the porch, the door creaking softly as it always did. The world beyond looked freshly washed, the fields glistening with dew, the air heavy with quiet after the storm. Birds moved restlessly through the trees, shaking the water from their wings, and the morning light touched everything like a blessing. He sat down in his chair, the one closest to the porch rail, and took his first slow sip. The coffee was hot and bitter, grounding him in the present moment. He watched a thin trail of mist rise from the lake down the hill. The surface was smooth as glass, the reflections of clouds shifting like gentle brushstrokes. He'd always loved how the lake could mirror the sky so perfectly. It made him think of how memory works, how the mind holds pieces of the past in a way that feels both clear and distorted, depending on the light. He picked up his carving knife and a block of cedar from the table beside him. His hands worked without needing to think, tracing shapes from habit and instinct. The sound of the blade slicing wood was crisp, a delicate rhythm that matched the birdsong around him. He was making a small figure, a bird perhaps, or maybe it was becoming something else. He didn't plan what he made anymore. He simply carved until the wood decided what it wanted to be. Time passed unnoticed, measured only by the way the sunlight shifted across the porch floor. By late morning, the mist had burned away, and the sky turned the clear, endless blue that always followed a summer storm. He set the carving aside and leaned back, his hands resting on his knees. He could feel the warmth of the boards beneath his bare feet, could hear the faint rustle of leaves in the oak tree beyond the yard. He looked at the tree for a long time. That tree had been there before he built the house. It had shaded every chapter of his life, his wedding reception, his daughter's birthdays, countless afternoons spent watching shadows crawl across the grass. Once he built a swing from its lowest branch, the rope tied firm, the seat sanded smooth. His daughter had swung there for hours, her laughter bright and wild, echoing through the field. He could still hear it sometimes like a memory carried by the wind. Around noon he noticed something unexpected. A figure was walking slowly up the dirt path from the main road. A woman, wearing a sun hat and a long light coat, carrying something in her hands. He squinted, shading his eyes. Visitors were rare these days. As she drew closer, he recognized the familiar shape of her shoulders, the way she walked sure but gentle. His heart gave a small, surprised leap. It was his daughter. He set down his mug and stood up, the motion a little too quick for his stiff knees. She smiled as she reached the porch, the same shy smile she had as a child when she came running to show him something she'd made. Now her hair was shorter, streaked faintly with early gray, and her eyes carried both city fatigue and something tender, relief, maybe, or longing. She stepped up onto the porch, and for a moment neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The air between them filled with a quiet understanding that words could only thin. "I brought you something," she said softly, lifting the bundle in her hand. It was wrapped in a blue cloth, tied neatly. Inside was a loaf of bread, still warm. He smiled, touched. "You remembered how to bake," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "I never forgot," she answered. He gestured to the chair beside his. She sat down, brushing a bit of dust from her coat. They sat there together just as they used to, staring out at the lake. The silence wasn't awkward. It was whole, filled with the sounds of the world. The cicadas, the distant rush of water, the soft groan of the porch boards beneath their feet. After a while she said, "It hasn't changed much." He chuckled quietly. "Porches don't need to. They just wait." She smiled at that, leaning back. "I miss the waiting sometimes," she said. He looked at her profile, the small creases at the corners of her eyes, the way she still tucked her hair behind her ear when she was thinking. "You could always wait here," he said. "It's still yours, you know." She didn't answer right away. Her eyes followed a bird that dipped low over the lake, wings catching light. "I know," she whispered. "I think I forgot what peace feels like." They stayed that way for a long while, saying little, letting the air between them do the work of healing what distance had frayed. The carpenter reached for the small wooden bird he had carved earlier and handed it to her. She turned it over in her hands, smiling at the smoothness of it, the small detail of feathers etched along the sides. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Like all your work." He shrugged. "It's just wood," he murmured. "No," she said, holding it up so the light touched it. "It's what you do with it that matters." Something in her tone stirred him, the same quiet conviction her mother used to have. He looked at her and saw traces of both past and future, woven together in a single gentle presence. For the first time in a long while, the porch felt new again, alive in a different way. They spent the afternoon talking in soft, unhurried voices, about her work, her city apartment, the noise she didn't like, the quiet she missed. She told him about books she was reading, people she'd met, and he listened the way he always had, fully, with small nods, with the silence that told her she could say anything and still be safe here. As dusk began to fall, she helped him light the small oil lamp on the table. The golden light spilled out onto the porch, catching dust motes and painting the air with warmth. The same sound of crickets rose from the field, and the smell of wet grass drifted through the air. They sat there together, their shadows long across the boards. When she finally stood to leave, the carpenter didn't stop her. He only walked her down the steps, the gravel crunching softly under their feet. At the bottom of the path, she turned and looked back at him. The porch light glowed behind him, soft and steady, and for a moment she looked like a child again, framed in evening light. "I'll come back soon," she said. "I'll be here," he replied. She smiled once more, and then she was gone, her figure fading into the quiet road, her footsteps swallowed by the night. He stood there a while longer, listening to the echo of her leaving. Then he climbed the steps back to the porch, sat down again, and looked at the chair she had just vacated. The wood was still warm where she had rested her hand. He touched it gently, feeling the faint trace of her presence, the quiet return of something he hadn't realized he'd been missing. Not just her company, but the reminder that life, even in its stillness, keeps unfolding. The moon rose slow over the lake, and the carpenter leaned back, the air cool and full of promise. The porch creaked softly beneath him, the board steady as always. He smiled to himself, closed his eyes, and let the sounds of the night carry him into rest. The whisper of wind through the trees, the faint lap of water below, the echo of laughter long gone but never lost. And there, on that porch that had seen every season of his life, the carpenter sat, surrounded by all that time could not take: love, memory, and the endless quiet rhythm of peace. The night deepened around the carpenter's porch, and the stars began to appear one by one like old friends arriving quietly. The moonlight draped itself over the railing, soft and pale, touching the wood with silver. He could hear the steady rhythm of the lake below, each wave whispering against the shore as though the world were breathing slowly, content to simply exist. He stayed seated for a long time, watching the reflection of the moon tremble on the water. The air was still and cool, carrying the faint hum of crickets and the distant croak of frogs. In that quiet, every sound felt amplified. The small groan of a floorboard as he shifted his weight, the rustle of leaves overhead, the faint hiss of the lamp flame beside him. He thought of his daughter's face as she turned at the end of the path, how it looked almost like his wife's used to when she said goodbye, gentle, sure, but with something unspoken in her eyes. Time was strange, he thought. It didn't move like a straight road but like a spiral, circling back to the same moments with new meaning. Tonight felt like one of those circles, an old memory reborn into something softer, something healed. He reached for the small carving knife again, running his thumb over the handle, worn smooth by years of use. The wood shavings from earlier were scattered across the porch floor, curling like thin ribbons. He picked up another piece of cedar and began to carve, not because he needed to, but because the act itself was a kind of prayer. The blade moved gently, and with every stroke, the scent of cedar rose in the air, sweet, grounding, familiar. It was the smell of home, of creation, of time measured in patient work rather than clocks. As he carved, his thoughts drifted. He remembered the first day he built this porch. It had been spring years ago, when his hands were stronger and his wife still hummed softly while kneading bread inside. He could still picture her standing by the doorway, her apron dusted with flour, watching him work with that amused smile she always had when he took on a project that was just for the joy of it. The boards had been new then, the nails shining, the smell of cut pine filling the air. He'd built it not for shelter, but for moments like this, quiet evenings, shared laughter, cups of tea cooling between words. When she passed, the porch had been the only place where he could sit and still feel her near. He used to talk to her when the nights grew long, telling her about the small things, how the tomatoes were growing, how the roof needed fixing, how the wind sounded different when autumn came. He never expected answers, but he felt them anyway, in the sway of the trees, in the creak of the steps, in the warmth that settled over him when he thought of her. Now, with his daughter's visit, the porch had come alive again in a way he hadn't realized he missed. The sound of her laughter, the way she looked around and said, "It hasn't changed much." It made him understand that this place had been waiting patiently just as he had. Waiting for her return. Waiting for that soft renewal of presence that only family could bring. The carving took shape slowly under his hands, a small figure of two birds perched side by side. He didn't know why he'd chosen that image until he was nearly done. When he lifted it in the lamplight, he realized one bird was slightly smaller than the other. The smaller one leaned into the larger, their wings almost touching. He smiled faintly. The memory of his wife teaching their daughter how to feed the sparrows came back to him so clearly, he could almost hear their voices. He set the carving gently on the table beside the lamp, the glow making it seem alive. Then he leaned back, listening. The world was vast in its stillness, the kind of vastness that made you aware of both your smallness and your belonging. The stars shimmered above the lake, and the moon seemed to float just above the water, so close it could be touched if one dared to reach. After a while, the carpenter rose and stepped down from the porch. The grass was cool beneath his feet, damp from evening dew. He walked toward the lake slow and steady, until he reached the small dock he'd built years ago. The wood beneath him creaked softly, the sound blending with the gentle splash of water against its edges. He sat at the end of it, his reflection trembling on the surface beside the moon's. He could see the faint outline of his house behind him, the porch light glowing, the window warm. It looked peaceful, like a painting frozen in a perfect moment. He thought of how many nights he had watched that same light from this very spot, how many seasons had come and gone while he remained here, steady as the dock itself. Life had changed, of course, but somehow the essence of it, the quiet beauty, the sense of purpose in stillness, had remained untouched. A breeze moved across the lake, rippling the surface. He closed his eyes and breathed it in. The smell of water and cedar mixed with the faint trace of the bread his daughter had baked. It felt like everything he loved existed in that one breath. The past, the present, and even the promise of what was still to come. When he opened his eyes, the night seemed to stretch endlessly before him. The stars reflected on the lake like scattered lanterns, and for a moment he imagined each one as a memory. Moments of laughter, warmth, and love suspended forever in the quiet dark. Some were dimmer, others brighter, but all were his. He stayed there until the chill of the air nudged him back toward the house. When he returned to the porch, he didn't go inside right away. He sat again in his chair, wrapping a blanket around his shoulders. The lamp's light had grown softer, its flame smaller, but it still burned, steady, loyal, patient. He thought that maybe that was what life really was. Not the big moments that come and go, but the small flame that keeps burning through them all. He looked again at the carving of the two birds. Tomorrow, he thought, he would send it to his daughter. Maybe she'd place it somewhere in her apartment. A reminder that home wasn't a single place, but the feeling you carried with you. The wind stirred, lifting the edges of the blanket. The carpenter smiled faintly and closed his eyes. He could hear the low hum of the night settling into itself, could feel the deep calm that came only when you stopped asking for more and simply listened. The porch creaked softly, and the house seemed to sigh, content. He sat there until sleep began to pull at him, slow and tender. His last thought before drifting off was not of the past, or of what had been lost, but of what remained. The warmth of love, the gift of memory, and the endless peace of the night surrounding his porch like a lullaby. The night stretched long and soft around the carpenter's house, as if the world itself had slowed to breathe beside him. The moon had climbed higher now, glowing faintly through thin clouds that drifted like thoughts too gentle to hold. The carpenter sat still, wrapped in his blanket, his body warm against the cool drift of night air. The wood beneath his feet creaked, not in protest but in conversation, like an old friend whispering just to remind him it was there. He could hear the faint ticking of the clock inside the house, marking the slow passage of moments that seemed almost suspended. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, one long mournful note that carried over the hills, fading into the trees. The sound didn't startle him. It was part of the world he knew, the same way the rain came in spring and the frost painted the windows in winter. He listened until it faded completely, until only the quiet hum of the night returned. He leaned back and let his mind wander, tracing the small stories that lived in every corner of the porch. There was the dent on the railing where his daughter had dropped her toy hammer and laughed until she cried. The small burn mark near the post where he'd once set down a lantern too hot. The faint scratchings on the doorframe where the old dog had waited to be let in. The marks of a life, all left behind in wood and time. He'd thought about sanding them away once, making things look new again, but he hadn't been able to. Each mark was a reminder of something real, something that had lived. The smell of cedar lingered around him, mixing with the cool scent of the lake air. It was a smell that could bring back whole years in a heartbeat. He thought of his father's workshop, a cramped room filled with the scent of wood and varnish, the air heavy with dust that glittered in the sunlight. He had learned everything there, standing on a small stool to reach the workbench, his hands clumsy at first, then surer, stronger. His father had never spoken much, but his lessons had been in the sound of the tools, the way he moved with patience and care. The wood will tell you what it wants to be, his father used to say. He had never forgotten that. The carpenter looked down at the porch boards, running his hand across the smooth surface. The grain glowed faintly in the lamplight, lines twisting and curling like veins. It was alive in its own quiet way. Maybe that's why he'd always loved wood. It grew in silence, endured storms, bent but rarely broke. It was patient. It was kind. The sky began to shift, ever so slightly, the deep indigo thinning at the edges into pale gray. The first hints of dawn were still far off, but he could feel the approach of it in the cool air, in the way the stars began to fade one by one. He thought about how many mornings he had seen from this very spot. Mornings with coffee steaming beside him, mornings when mist rolled off the lake like breath, mornings when birds broke the silence with their bright chatter. Each one had carried its own kind of peace. He wondered what his daughter was doing now, miles away under a different sky. Maybe she was asleep. Maybe she was looking out her own window, thinking of him. He hoped she was happy. That had always been enough for him, to know she was safe, that her world was kind. He had spent his life building things that would last, and though she wasn't made of wood or nails or anything that could be shaped by his hands, he hoped he had built something lasting in her too. Something gentle, something strong. A soft rustle came from the edge of the yard, and he turned his head slightly. A deer had stepped into the clearing, its body lit faintly by the moon. It moved slowly, graceful, pausing to lift its head toward the porch. For a moment their eyes met, a quiet, wordless exchange between two creatures sharing the same stillness. Then it lowered its head again and continued toward the trees. He watched it disappear, feeling a small, inexplicable comfort. The carpenter's breath deepened, his body relaxing further into the chair. The world around him seemed to settle into a perfect stillness, as though even time had chosen to pause and rest beside him. The lake shimmered faintly below, the moonlight softening into a haze that seemed almost to glow from within the water itself. He thought again of the carving of the two birds resting side by side. It sat on the table beside the lamp, the wood smooth and pale, their small beaks almost touching. He imagined his daughter finding it in the morning when she came to visit next, running her fingers over the surface, smiling quietly the way her mother used to. She'd know without words what it meant. His eyelids grew heavier, and for a moment, he let them close. Behind them, the sounds of the night painted a picture of peace, the distant murmur of the water, the sigh of the wind moving gently through the trees, the steady rhythm of his own heartbeat. The air felt cool on his face, the scent of cedar and lake mingling into something soft and eternal. Sleep didn't take him all at once. It came like the tide, slow and patient, washing over him in gentle waves. Each breath grew longer, slower, until the line between waking and dreaming blurred completely. He wasn't sure if he had drifted into a dream or if the world had simply softened around him, but he saw things clearly. His wife standing by the lake, smiling at him, her hair moving in the wind, her eyes warm. His daughter as a child again, running barefoot through the grass, laughing as she held up a handful of daisies. The porch glowing with evening light, the air thick with summer warmth, the sound of the old dog barking happily nearby. He felt no sadness, no weight, only the fullness of life, of everything that had been, everything that still lived within the walls and the wood and the air around him. The porch had become a keeper of it all, a quiet vessel of memory and peace. When dawn finally came, it arrived softly, almost shyly, spilling gold light over the fields and across the porch. The chair rocked gently in the breeze. The lamp had burned low, its flame gone, leaving only the faint scent of smoke and oil. Birds began to sing, their voices breaking the long stillness of the night. The carpenter's tools rested neatly on the table, the carving of the two birds catching the first rays of the morning sun. The house stood quiet, filled with the calm he had built into it over years of love and patience. The porch creaked once, softly as if sighing. The wind lifted through the open field, carrying with it the scent of cedar and dawn, a whisper of all the stories the carpenter had left behind, still alive, still breathing, still waiting for the next soul to sit and listen. Years passed quietly, as they always do, and the seasons began their endless circle once more. The house on the edge of the field remained, standing steady through the storms, through the long golden summers, through the soft gray winters when snow gathered on the roof like a hush laid gently over the world. The porch aged, but gracefully. Its boards darkened with time, and a few cracks appeared along the railing, yet it never lost its warmth. The scent of cedar still lingered faintly in the air, especially when the rain came and soaked into the wood. The lake below continued its rhythm, freezing solid in winter, sparkling in summer, whispering secrets to the wind that moved through the reeds. The trees grew thicker around the edges of the property, the oaks and maples stretching their limbs toward the sun as if reaching for something unseen. Life moved quietly there, as though the place itself had learned to breathe slowly, in time with the memory of the man who once sat watching the horizon. For a long while the house was empty. Birds nested in the eaves. The grass grew wild, brushing against the porch steps. On still mornings when mist hung low over the lake, the house seemed like something from a dream, a place half forgotten by time, waiting for someone to remember it. One spring morning someone did. A woman in her early 30s, wearing a heavy coat and carrying a small satchel, came walking up the old dirt road. Her boots crunched softly against the gravel. She stopped when the house came into view. The wind lifted her hair, carrying the scent of pine and rain. She stood there for a long moment, her eyes moving over the porch, the windows, the outline of the roof. Then she smiled. Not a wide smile, but one of recognition, of homecoming. She stepped onto the porch slowly, as if afraid to disturb its quiet. The wood groaned faintly beneath her weight, but it held firm. Her hand brushed the railing, and she could feel the texture of it, the small grooves, the uneven spots smoothed by years of touch. It felt like the echo of a hand she knew well. She had been here before many years ago. Her childhood memories were faint, like a watercolor painting left in the sun too long, but they came back now in small flashes. The smell of her father's coffee, the sound of his laughter mixing with the chirping of crickets, the way the porch light used to glow golden against the dark. She could almost see him sitting there, a book in one hand, a carving knife in the other, his face calm and patient as he worked. Inside, everything was still. Dust lay in soft sheets over the table and chairs, and the air was thick with the faint sweetness of aged wood. The light streamed through the windows, illuminating motes of dust that floated lazily like tiny stars. On the table by the window, she found the small carving of two birds. The wood was worn smooth now, but their forms were clear, one slightly smaller, leaning toward the other. Her fingers trembled as she lifted it. She remembered this carving. She had taken it with her once when she left, then sent it back years later in a small box with a note. He must have kept it here ever since. She sat on his old chair, the same one that creaked softly when he rocked in it. The sound filled the silence like an old lullaby. Her eyes drifted to the window, where the lake shimmered faintly through the trees. The same lake, the same light, the same wind. Nothing here had changed except time. She took a deep breath, and the air felt full of memory, full of presence. It was as if the walls themselves remembered her father, remembered every word he had ever spoken in this place. She could almost hear his voice again, steady and kind, telling her about the trees, about how to plane wood properly, about patience. Everything takes the time it needs, he used to say. That's how you know it's real. The afternoon light deepened. She went outside again and sat on the porch steps, her hands folded loosely in her lap. The air was warm, and a few early fireflies had already begun to glow near the edge of the yard. She stayed there for hours watching the light fade, listening to the same songs the night had always sung, the whisper of wind through the grass, the ripple of water, the soft creak of the boards beneath her. As darkness settled, she took the small carving and placed it on the railing where the moonlight could reach it. The two birds glowed faintly in the silver light, as if alive. For a moment, she thought she could almost see a shape sitting in the chair beside her. Her father, calm and at peace, smiling at the night. It wasn't frightening. It was gentle, familiar, like seeing someone you love in a dream that you don't want to end. She whispered softly, "I kept your lessons, Dad." Her voice trembled. "I build things now too. Maybe not the same way, but I still listen to the wood. I still take my time." The breeze rose slightly, brushing her hair from her face, and she felt it. Not the chill of air, but a quiet warmth, the kind that lingers after a hand has touched your shoulder. She closed her eyes and let it stay there. The stars came out again, bright and countless. The porch glowed faintly in the night, the same way it always had. A small island of calm in an ever-moving world. She sat until she grew tired, until the night wrapped itself around her like a blanket. Before going inside, she turned once more toward the lake. The moon floated above it, still and round, just as her father had once watched it. When she finally slept, she dreamed of him, not as the old man he'd become, but as she remembered him best. Strong hands, quiet eyes, the faint smile of someone who found beauty in patience. In her dream, the porch light burned steady, and the sound of the lake mingled with the soft hum of the night. Morning came gently, pale gold spilling through the windows. The house, though quiet, felt alive again. She opened the door and let the air move freely through the rooms. Dust lifted and sparkled in the light. The smell of wood warmed by sun filled every corner. She made coffee the way he used to, strong, black, no sugar, and carried it outside. She sat on the porch again, sipping slowly, watching the lake. A bird landed on the railing beside the carving and chirped softly, as if greeting her. She smiled, her heart both heavy and full. She knew she couldn't stay here forever, that the world beyond was waiting, but for now, she let herself sink into the moment. The sound of the breeze, the warmth of the morning, the steady peace that seemed to rise from the boards beneath her feet. Before leaving later that afternoon, she walked around the house, touching the walls, the door frame, the old tools still hanging in the shed. She whispered a thank you not to any one thing but to everything, to the wood, the air, the silence that had kept her father's presence alive. As she stepped off the porch, she looked back one last time. The house seemed to breathe with the wind, alive and eternal. She smiled softly and said, "Goodbye for now." Then she walked down the path toward the road, her figure small against the wide, open fields. The sun dipped lower, and the house returned to stillness. The light shifted across the porch, touching the carving of the two birds once more. Somewhere deep in the wood, in the quiet heart of the boards, something seemed to remember. Not in words but in feeling, the warmth of hands, the rhythm of life, the peace of long evenings spent listening to the world breathe. The porch waited, as it always had, for the next moment, the next presence, the next story to unfold beneath its patient watch. And the wind carried on, moving softly across the fields, whispering through the wood, humming the same calm tune the carpenter once heard every night. A song without beginning or end, a song that promised that nothing truly beautiful is ever lost. The morning light spilled across the carpenter's porch like warm honey, pouring through the thin gaps in the wooden slats, illuminating dust motes that drifted lazily in the air. The old house, nestled on the edge of a quiet village, seemed to hum with its own soft breath. Every board and nail had a story. Every tool hanging on the pegboard had been touched by time, patience, and care. Eli, the carpenter, was a man who had long learned the rhythm of quiet days. His beard had turned silver. His hands were knotted with age, yet steady as ever. Every morning began with the same ritual, the kettle whistling low, the porch creaking under his boots, and the cup of steaming tea resting beside his worn-out journal. The porch was his sanctuary, a wooden embrace that looked out over the meadow where the fog still lingered like forgotten dreams. He had built the porch himself decades ago, when his wife, Clara, had asked for a place where sunsets could be shared. She had loved sitting there with him, her laughter echoing softly into the twilight. But time, like a tide, had taken her away. Now only the echoes remained, faint but never gone. The chair she had favored still sat across from his, her shawl draped over the back as though she might return any moment to pick it up. Each morning Eli spoke to her softly, not aloud, but in the gentle rhythm of his hands as he sanded wood, in the careful way he placed the nails, in the pauses he took to look out at the horizon. His craft was not just about shaping timber anymore. It was about shaping memories, giving them a form that would outlast the fragile vessel of the heart. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip low, a soft knock echoed from the front gate. Eli rarely had visitors, and the sound stirred something in him. He rose, brushed sawdust from his apron, and opened the gate to find a young woman standing there, clutching a small suitcase and looking unsure of herself. Her name was Mara, and she had come to the village in search of quiet, the kind of quiet that only people who've been through storms truly crave. She had heard of the old carpenter who lived by the meadow, who built furniture that seemed to hum with warmth. She wanted to learn, she said, not just woodworking but the stillness that lived in his hands. Eli saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the same kind he had once carried. He nodded, told her to come in, and soon enough, the porch had 2 cups of tea again. Days became weeks, and under Eli's careful guidance, Mara began to learn the language of wood, how it spoke when cut too deep, how it sighed when treated with patience. The work was slow, but it calmed her. She learned that the secret was not in forcing the material, but in listening to it. It reminded her of life itself, how much gentler things became when one stopped fighting against their natural grain. As they worked together, Eli began to notice the life returning to the porch, the laughter, the questions, the faint hum of energy that he had thought long gone. Sometimes, when Mara left at dusk, he would linger a while longer, tracing the outlines of Clara's shawl, whispering a quiet thank you. One evening, rain began to fall, a soft, persistent drizzle that turned the world silver. Mara stayed late, helping Eli move tools inside. When the power flickered and went out, they lit a lantern and sat together, listening to the rain pattering on the roof. She told him about her life, the city she had left behind, the noise that had drowned out her peace, the ache of trying to be too much for too many people. Eli listened, as he always did, without interrupting. When she fell silent, he told her about Clara, about love that didn't vanish when bodies did, about how grief was just another form of keeping someone close. The porch glowed softly in the lantern light, a small island of warmth in the sea of night. Outside, the rain whispered on, washing the world clean. Inside, Mara felt something stir, a kind of stillness that wasn't emptiness but fullness. It was the quiet acceptance that everything passes, and yet, in some way, everything stays. Over the next months, the porch became a place of creation once more. They built chairs, tables, and small carved birds that seemed ready to take flight. Mara's hands grew strong, her spirit calmer. And one morning, she arrived early to find Eli asleep in his chair, the tools neatly set aside. The sunrise bathed him in gold. He looked peaceful, like a man who had finally finished his last piece. There was no sadness, only the kind of silence that feels sacred. On the workbench lay a note in Eli's neat handwriting. It said, "The porch is yours now. Keep building. Keep listening. And when you're done, leave space for the next soul who needs a quiet place." Years passed, and the carpenter's porch never truly fell silent. Mara kept it alive, teaching others, offering them the stillness she had found. The porch grew weathered, the paint faded, but it stood firm, humming softly in the wind. On some evenings, when the light turned just right, she could swear she heard 2 faint voices, Eli's deep, calm tone and Clara's gentle laughter, mingling with the creak of the wood. And so, the porch that love built continued to hold its purpose, a resting place between past and present, where weary hearts could sit for a while and remember that peace is not the absence of sound, but the presence of understanding. The days drifted on gently, one melting into the next like watercolor on paper. The air around the carpenter's porch always seemed to hum with its own soft melody, the rustle of leaves, the distant song of the meadow birds, the slow sigh of the wind brushing through the tall grass. It was a place that felt removed from time, where moments lingered longer than they should, stretching out in the golden haze of morning and the lavender calm of twilight. Mara had grown used to the rhythm of life there. She would arrive just after dawn, her boots still damp with dew, her breath visible in the cool air. Eli would already be on the porch, the kettle steaming, 2 cups waiting. He didn't say much in those early hours. He never needed to. The silence between them wasn't heavy. It was full, like the comfortable hush between old friends who understand that words can sometimes get in the way of truth. The first task of each day was simple: to listen. That was Eli's only rule. Before lifting a hammer or sanding a board, they would sit and listen to the world. The chirping of the robins, the crackle of the porch boards expanding in the sun, the distant hum of life beyond the meadow. Everything has a sound, he once told her. If you listen long enough, even wood will tell you what it wants to become. At first, Mara thought it was just one of his old sayings, poetic but not literal. Yet the more time she spent in that quiet, the more she began to understand. There was indeed a rhythm in everything. Each piece of timber carried its own grain. Each nail found its own place. Each movement had a pace that could not be rushed. And slowly, that rhythm began to sink into her bones. She stopped hurrying. Her thoughts, once tangled like knots of string, began to smooth out. The silence, which had once frightened her, began to feel like home. There were moments she would pause mid-task, hands still on the wood, just to breathe, to feel the faint warmth of sunlight through the porch beams and the soft, forgiving scent of pine dust in the air. One evening, as twilight gathered over the meadow, Eli asked Mara to help him repair an old rocking chair that had been sitting by the far corner of the porch for years. It was Clara's chair. The wood had faded, the joints loosened, and the seat sagged slightly, but it still rocked with a familiar, gentle creak, like an old lullaby. Mara worked carefully, afraid to damage something that carried so much memory. "Don't be afraid," Eli said softly, watching her hands tremble slightly. "Wood remembers kindness. It doesn't forget the hands that touch it with care." That night, when the repairs were finished, Eli sat in the chair and began to hum. A tune low and slow, one that seemed to come from deep within his chest. Mara sat nearby, not speaking. The fireflies had begun their dance across the meadow, and the sky was awash with stars. It was one of those rare nights when the world feels perfectly still, as though holding its breath. He didn't say much after that. He simply watched the horizon, the way the moonlight touched the grass, and for a long while, the porch was quiet except for the creak of the rocking chair. Mara had the strange feeling that he was saying goodbye. Not to her, but to the world itself. The next morning, she came to find him there again, sitting with his hands folded, the shawl beside him. His tea was still warm. The sun had risen, casting golden light over his peaceful face. It took her a long time to move, to understand that the rhythm she had grown so used to had shifted, that the hum of the world had softened by one gentle heartbeat. For days she moved through the motions silently, unable to speak the words she didn't yet accept. But then she found the note on the workbench, short, written in the careful hand of someone who had taken his time. "The porch belongs to the morning. You belong to the light. Keep building, Mara. What you make will last longer than both of us." She cried then, not the kind of crying that breaks you open, but the kind that heals. Slow, quiet tears that carried no bitterness. Afterward, she stood on the porch, letting the wind brush against her face. It was the same wind that had once carried Clara's laughter, the same that had whispered through Eli's hair. And she realized that nothing truly left. It all stayed, woven into the wood, into the air, into the calm that wrapped around the place like a blanket. Seasons began to pass. Spring brought new blooms to the meadow. Summer filled the air with the scent of wildflowers. Autumn painted everything in gold. Mara stayed. The porch remained her anchor. Villagers would come by sometimes, people who had heard of the woman who listens to wood. They would bring broken chairs, cracked tables, or sometimes just their worries. She never turned anyone away. She'd pour them tea, let them sit for a while, and eventually the stillness of the place would do what words could not. Children came too. They loved watching her work, the way she ran her fingers across each surface, listening before cutting or sanding. She taught them the small, patient art of paying attention to the creak of the floorboards, the sigh of the trees, the whisper of their own breath. It became a kind of quiet ritual. Sometimes, on cool evenings, Mara would take Clara's old chair and sit where Eli once sat. The stars would appear one by one, and the world would hum its soft lullaby. In those moments, she didn't feel alone. She felt surrounded by memories, by love, by the quiet persistence of all things that endure. Years later, when Mara herself grew older, she found herself writing a letter too, one she left tucked in the folds of the shawl. If you found this place, stay for a while. The porch doesn't ask much, just that you listen, just that you breathe. There's peace in the sound of quiet things. And so it continued. The carpenter's porch became more than a workshop. It became a refuge, a place for the tired, the lost, the hopeful. The boards aged, the nails rusted, but the spirit of it never faded. When the wind moved through the meadow at dusk, you could still hear the soft creak of the old rocking chair, keeping time with the pulse of the earth itself. As the years slipped by, the carpenter's porch became something more than anyone had ever planned for. It was no longer just a place where wood was shaped and mended. It became a place where people came to remember what stillness felt like. The world outside moved fast, racing and buzzing with noise and light, but here, on this quiet stretch of wood and shadow, time folded softly, like a page turned gently in an old book. Mara had grown older now. Her hair, once dark, had silvered in the same tender way Eli's had. Yet her hands still moved with the same grace, the same patience he had taught her. Every morning she made 2 cups of tea, just as he used to, setting one across from her as the sun rose. She didn't speak much anymore, but she smiled at the silence, knowing it carried the echoes of those who had sat there before. The porch held everything: Clara's laughter that still seemed to ripple faintly in the air, Eli's steady voice murmuring wisdom in the rhythm of creaking boards, the footsteps of the villagers who had come to find peace and left lighter than they arrived. Even the tools, resting neatly in their places, seemed to hum quietly in the dusk, as though they too remembered the touch of the carpenter's hands. Mara spent her final summer watching the meadow bloom. The grass shimmered in the breeze, and the smell of honeysuckle drifted through the air. Every evening she would sit in the old rocking chair, now smooth and soft from decades of use. She would listen to the world's small noises, the hum of the insects, the sigh of the wind, and sometimes, if she closed her eyes, she could almost hear a voice beside her. "You've done well," it would whisper low and kind. "You kept the quiet alive." On the night she didn't wake, the stars hung low and bright, their reflection shimmering in the windows of the porch. The lantern by her chair flickered softly until the oil ran out, and then the night took over, gentle, infinite, serene. When dawn came, the light slipped through the porch just as it always had. Birds sang, the floorboards warmed beneath the sun, and the world moved on, unchanged yet deeply touched. The villagers found her there, peaceful, her hands resting over the shawl that had belonged to Clara. On the workbench beside her was a small carving, unfinished but beautiful, a tiny sparrow with its wings spread wide, ready to take flight. They buried her beneath the oak tree overlooking the meadow, beside the path that led to the porch. And though her hands no longer shaped the wood, the rhythm she had learned, and then taught, remained. Others came, a traveler passing through, a lost soul seeking calm, a child curious about the world. The porch accepted them all. It didn't ask for much, only that they listen. Seasons continued to pass. The wood darkened with age, the nails grew soft with rust, yet it stood strong against every storm. And when the wind swept through at dusk, the boards creaked softly in a rhythm that sounded like breathing. In that sound, if you listened long enough, you could still hear them all: Eli, Clara, Mara, and the gentle hum of love and craft that had built more than a porch. It had built a refuge, a heartbeat that would never fade. And so, when night settles across the meadow and the air cools, the carpenter's porch waits. It waits for footsteps on its old boards, for the hush of someone sitting down, for the slow, steady rhythm of breath finding peace again. Because that is what it was always meant for, not to build things of wood, but to rebuild the quiet places within the human heart. And if you ever pass through that little village and find yourself tired, stop for a while. Sit on the porch. Feel the warmth in the wood beneath your hands. Listen to the evening wind. You'll hear it, the faint hum of the carpenter's world, the sound of calm, the sound of home. Sleep well now. The porch is still there, holding the silence for you. And so, dear dreamer, our story finds its gentle close, but your night continues, calm and unbroken. Let your thoughts drift, as lightly as clouds across a moonlit sky. Let your body sink, as deeply as roots into the quiet earth. There is no need to hold on, no need to listen further, only to rest, for the story remains with you, carrying you through the night, until morning's light comes softly to call. Good night, and sweet dreams. From the Midnight Library. Crescent moon sparkles, break time equals 2000. forward slash